When I first arrived in Australia, this is what I thought an Indigenous person looked like. A black fellow from the outback, wearing traditional clothing and body paint, but I found there was so much more than that. There was a mix of culture, art, music, dance, and identity. In this presentation, I will focus on the performances of the 2000 Olympics closing ceremony and the opening ceremony of the 2018 Commonwealth Games. One might ask why I chose these performances. I chose them not only because Christina New performed her song My Island Home in both of them, but because of the change in my perspective of when I first started this class and watching the 2000 closing ceremony with fresh eyes to watching the 2018 opening ceremony with renewed eyes. I will not only share the Indigenous perspective of the performance, but an outsider perspective and my journey to understanding. To start, here's a short clip of Christina New singing My Island Home, which she performed during the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Sadly, no footage of the performance is available.
6 years I've been in the city, and every night I dream of the sea. They say home is where you find it. Will this place ever satisfy me? For I come from the soul, water people. We always live by the sea. Now I'm down here living in the city with my man and the family. My island home, my island home, my island home is waiting for me.
In the performance at the Olympics, it is very glamorized with the clothing and dance, with a sense of unity. When I first watched the performance for the Sydney Olympics, I thought, wow, she did a beautiful job. The clothing was cool and modern, and the song spoke of a united nation. But the class thought otherwise when we opened up for discussion. They felt the clothing was not traditional, and the performance was just a way for Australia to broadcast a united nation, when the reality was there were protesters on their doorstep, demonstrating outside, begging for their cries to be heard. Heard? But by whom? A country who would not claim them? Who did not acknowledge their existence? Perhaps for the world to know their story, to hear them, not just listen, but understand. In this moment, I knew that Christine's performance was much more than a performance, but a chance to be heard. As an outsider, I had no idea about these demonstrations. Most of the reviews of the performance were positive, and most of those reviews were about Anu. Christina New is a Torres Strait Islander. The performance gave her the ability to be known around the world. Burgess states, her performance of My Island Home at the closing ceremony of Sydney Olympics is something well remembered around the world. But the glory is that she's not just a wonderful singer. Christine is an accomplished Australian songwriter as well, and this is worthy of great recognition. Out of all songs to sing, she chose My Island Home. My Island Home was originally written by Neil Murray, the only white member in an Indigenous band called the Warumpi Band. Anu changed some of the original lyrics. One of the new verses she changed was country into city, indicating a more modern and urbanized Australia. The Indigenous community liked the song and used it as an anthem. It was described as a song that many Indigenous mobs relate to and hold close to their hearts. Although most of the reviews were positive, there were some negative. In Stan Grant's Talking to My Country, he talks about how he felt he was not represented as an Aboriginal person of Australia. Stan talks about how he felt as if he was in a foreign place, yet Australia is his country. This sense of country reminded me of something the Dalai Lama said. Wherever you have friends, that's your country, and wherever you receive love, that's your home. But where were the First Nations people's friends amongst all this hate, not love? The struggle to find country and a place of belonging seems to be an ongoing trial. Also, Christine's spotlight failed to recognize what was happening in the background, broadcasting a fake reality, ignoring the actual reality by advertising her success, not the country's. failure at representing its people. It wasn't really empowering Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders. Christine's performance was stripped of Indigenous aspects just like my class was vocalizing. After watching the performance, hearing what my classmates had to say, and reading the Indigenous reviews, I knew I still had a lot to learn. So I dug into the readings. I read Talking to My Country by Stan Grant, and I heard the cries and I understood. With this newfound perspective, I watched the opening ceremony of the 2018 Commonwealth Games.
Our home is Australia. We are a land bound by sea. And though I may travel far across the oceans, it will never know, forget me. Yes, on my island home, my island home, my island home is waiting for me.
From the north to the south, to the east, to the west, let a baller take it home. Island style represent, put your soul to the flow. Love your set, represent, raise your pride to the sky. Love it like it's the best. Unite with music, heart and mind reconnect. Feel we're blessed when the music connects. Unite with music, heart and mind reconnect. Ancestors take us on that quest.
My island home,
We connect
my island home,
on that quest.
my island home, surrounded by sea. My island home,
We connect
my island home,
on that quest.
my island home in the cosmic sea.
Flash forward 18 years, and with this newfound perspective, I knew the opening performance was very different. The music, dance, and dress of the performers seemed more traditional compared to the 2000 performance. Stoltz indicates the ceremony featured a didgeridoo orchestra, dramatic performance by the acclaimed Banjara dancers, and a traditional smoking ceremony in which Prince Charles and his wife were blessed Aboriginal style inside the royal box, a dramatic but deeply spiritual Indigenous scene. Another difference was a change of lyrics again in My Island Home. Instead of Christine singing the well-known verse of My Island Home, she interchanged it between island and cosmic. The effect I believe this had was that cosmic was supposed to give a sense of unity of not only the country of Australia but of all the Commonwealth. I felt that the performance portrayed the Indigenous traditions better than the Olympic performance did, but the performance still fabricated what people wanted to see, and not what was happening outside of the scene. In contrast, the performance still inlaid a fake unity. There were protesters outside the arena just like there were at the 2000 Olympic. Eddie Sinot, an Indigenous man, recognized these two opposing factors, a celebration inside but protesters outside, demanding for more social justice, calling themselves the Stonewall. This indicates how Australia is still broadcasting a positive relationship with their First Nations people, but still failed to give them justice. In Stan Grant's speech, he states, "My people die young in this country. We die 10 years younger than average Australians, and we are far from free. We are fewer than 3% of the Australian population, and yet we are 25%, a quarter of those Australians, locked up in our prisons. And if you are juvenile, it is worse. It is 50%. An Indigenous child is more likely to be locked up in prison than they are to finish high school. That does not seem like justice to me." In conclusion, my understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, music, art, and dance has drastically changed from first starting this class. It was also compelling to see the transformation of my perspective from watching the 2000 Sydney Olympic closing ceremony to watching the 2018 Commonwealth Games opening ceremony. 18 years between both performances, and a lot has changed. Those voices were heard, and if they weren't, they are getting louder so that no one can ignore, and for one, I have heard.